Margaret, we're live.
Thank you, Gaston. Good morning, everyone, assuming it's morning your time. Thank you so much for joining us for this Inter-American Dialogue event. Today, we will consider whether Latin America has maximized or alternatively missed out on China's international development strategy. Which countries, if any, in the Latin American region have made the most of growing ties to China, and which have not benefited so clearly from these ties, and why? And then how, looking ahead, can Latin American nations try to ensure best outcomes and indeed maximize the benefits of their engagements with China? All of this and more is addressed in a book written by our esteemed guest, Carol Wise, and published a few months back by Yale University Press. But I'd say that these questions are as pertinent now as ever, as Chinese companies may again find themselves in the aftermath of COVID-19 in a fairly favorable position to secure Latin American and Caribbean assets, assuming they choose to do so. And with a clear interest among those on both sides, China and throughout Latin America, in many cases, to boost bilateral trade. Carol Wise is a professor in the School of International Relations at the University of Southern California and was previously a professor here in DC, here where I'm sitting in DC at SAIS. She specializes in international political economy and development with an emphasis on Latin America and Pacific Asia, and has written extensively on trade integration, exchange rate crises, institutional reform, and the political economy of market restructuring in the region. I was quite honored to work with Carol on another of her semi-recent books, an edited volume called The Political Economy of China-Latin America Relations in the New Millennium. Joining us to comment on Carol's presentation is Francisco Ordines, who is assistant professor at the Political Science Institute of the Pontifical Catholic University in Chile. Francisco is a prolific writer on China-Latin America relations, and especially on issues related to international political economy. He was previously a scholar at the Sao Paulo Research Foundation and a researcher at the Center for the Study of International Negotiations, which is affiliated with the University of Sao Paulo. It is a great pleasure to host you both. Thank you so much for being here. And before we get started, I'll remind those joining us today, and we have a really fantastic group, to please submit questions, any questions you have for either of the speakers, to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, or else to meetings@thedialogue.org. And we'll get to those during a hopefully extensive Q&A at the end of the session. And with that, Carol, let me turn the floor to you so we can delve into your book.
Thank you so much. Oh, it's been a long haul, a year in hibernation, and just seeing you on Zoom is making me want to see you so much more in person. But hopefully we're looking at the beginning of the end. I am so proud to be with Dialogue. I've been associated with them since the late 1980s, and it's just always a pleasure. Let me say that about my topic. Let me turn to my topic. Margaret's a taskmaster. I have to really watch my time. So let me say that in 2006, early 2006, I was a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and I met a Chinese scholar in the hallway at Woodrow Wilson, and, chat in the hallway. And I said, what are you working on? And she said, China-Latin America relations. And I'm thinking, what's that? What is that? And of course, what was that? That was the beginning of what we would then call the largest commodity boom we have ever seen. It was the beginning of the effects of China's final entry into the World Trade Organization, which of course put China up several notches in terms of its export-led manufacturing development model, and several more notches in terms of its huge demand for resources. And of course, Mother Nature has bestowed Latin America with incredible resources, right? So countries find each other in these situations, and it really was the biggest boom Latin America has ever seen. Let me turn to a PowerPoint with some of the main points of the book. I'm going to just let's see here. Got it. Okay. Let me go back to the beginning. All right. Margaret is kind to say that the book came out several months ago. The book came out 13 months ago. But let me say that I had held off on doing any launches because I was hoping we could be together and I could do this in person. Clearly, that's not happening. So here we go with the PowerPoint presentation online. Now, just a quick introduction, a little bit of a reiteration of what I started with is that unit prices on these commodities you see on the screen just absolutely exploded. And of course, I've written on the winners, the big winners, which are Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Peru, in terms of the price boom. I've also written on Costa Rica as a new member of a China alliance. And a signer of a free trade agreement with China. And then Mexico. Even countries I say like Mexico were able to benefit because Mexico prides itself on having diversified away from primary exports and of course gone into this industrial export-led model, which is heavily dependent on the United States, as we all know. So Mexico's here because it's got a huge trade relationship with China on the deficit side. At last count, Mexico's trade deficit with China was $78 billion. So what we've seen with hindsight, the commodity boom ended 2013, 2014, but we have seen, obviously, when you have this much capital coming in, and this many project proposals and whatnot, you have really big opportunities, lots of fiscal leeway, as I say here, for poverty reduction, credit expansion, and productive investment, but also for corruption. And I think probably, as we all know, the saddest case is Brazil and the Petrobras scandal. The country and the company went from investment grade to junk bond rating in about 6 months, which is just tragic. So we've seen slower growth in Latin America and the Caribbean since 2013. And now we've seen something that is just so tragic, which is the absolute plummeting, not slowing, but we're down in the minus territory in the region. I have invited Francisco as my discussant, not only because he is the rising star of international political economy and political economy in the region, and a walking encyclopedia on these issues. So we're going to discuss all of this. Let me just go now to the summarizing points of the book. Oh, also I want to say I stopped. The book went to press, let's see, in early 2019, and I get it right up to the pandemic, right? But that was not on the horizon when the book came out. So Francisco is also here to update us like where the book stops, and he's been working on the pandemic, on all issues of it, Chinese mask diplomacy, the effects of the pandemic on the region. We can turn to that in the Q&A, although let's just say that most of the indicators are in the negative territory. Okay, so I take on several arguments in the book. I say, and I've been accused in reviews of being naive and clueless. I insist till today that China has no resources. They've got coal, huge territory, very resource poor. And that what we're seeing in Latin America, we saw in Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, which is an internationalization of their development strategy, and Belt and Road is certainly part of this, Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. So, the Trump people were very big on Chinese encroachment, Chinese, strategic, intervention and threat to the region. And I have looked high and low for a military alliance, for a plan to build a base, for fancy arms transfers from China to the Western Hemisphere or Latin America, and I'm not seeing it. If you're there, Evan Ellis, I'm not seeing it. So the success has varied according to issuaries, sectors, projects, and whatnot. And I would say that the common narrative on China, say in the Financial Times or the New York Times or the Economist, mainly the media, is that a lot of these projects that have been sponsored by China are not successful. That's not true. We have lots of instances of success, but we have no one template. It varies by issue area, sector, projects itself, and of course the countries. So now I have a chapter 2, which is a historical chapter, which I really loved writing because I'm not a sinologist, obviously, to those of you who know me. And it was really interesting to do a history from, say, 49 or 50, the Mao era, all the way up to the present. So what we see is that there was an interesting political relationship, not super strong, but communist parties, leftist parties, and whatnot, partnering with the Chinese. The Chinese were having them over for delegations and whatnot as early as the 50s, right? And so what we see over time is a pattern of path dependence for Argentina and Brazil, especially, but also Mexico. So what do I mean by that? I mean that Brazil and Argentina have never exported industrial goods to China. Before the pandemic, you go to this conference, you go to that conference. Neither have Chile and Peru, of course. But you go here, you go there, and the people in the trade ministries throughout the region are complaining they just can't get their industrial exports into the Chinese market. Well, hello, you've never been able to send them to the Chinese market. In the beginning, China was too poor to buy them, and then in the 90s, the tables turned, and the Chinese said, "We're sorry, your industrial goods are really pretty bad." So all of this, real kind of vocal complaining. There's never been a relationship of exporting industrial goods to China. Mexico did the best as it was gearing up in the 80s and beginning 90s for its own shift to an industrial export model. But after 93, when that trade relationship turned negative for Mexico, it's just been a matter of China flooding the Mexican market. During the US-China trade war, which I guess is still on, I'd hoped it would be over by now, Mexico lucked out because the Trump people, I guess inadvertently, shut themselves out of the very big global value chain for auto and electronic trade with China. And Mexico was able to step in and provide some of those goods to the Chinese market. What does that tell us? That tells us that with more effort, more focus, and if Andrés Manuel López Obrador could see through it, the Mexican president, they have a potential to really become integrated, much more integrated into these industrial sectors. He has no interest. He's gone nationalist. He closed the export market of the export agency, Mexican export agency, Pro Mexico. He closed it in Beijing. So off we go on another cul-de-sac, right? So now, I take the small open economies, mainly Peru and Chile, which have also got long relationships with China, as negotiating what I call new relationships. And this is, of course, the free trade agreements. And I'll say more about that in a moment. So just to reiterate point 4, it was an amazing opportunity to get some reforms done that had not been undertaken prior to the boom. If we remember back in 2000, 2001, Argentina and Brazil were in the basement. They had both suffered different currency crises and economic, plummets and whatnot. And this was really a time for them to have the room to maneuver to implement some really important reforms, institutional reforms around antitrust, oversight, regulatory oversight and whatnot. And they did squander that opportunity. It's just indisputable that it was squandered, unfortunately. Okay, so I've got some data. Always start with the data. Let's get some empirical validity to some of this. The question here is, we know the 80s were bad, and this documents it. Of course, during this time, China was beginning to really soar, all right? Then we go to the so-called, Washington Consensus Market Reform period. Oops, I jumped ahead, excuse me, 91 to 2000. And Even though Argentina had the crisis of all crises, it came out pretty well, right? China's still booming. Peru's coming up. Costa Rica's coming up. And Brazil is, doing its usual sluggish, underperformance, but it's growing. If we look at the big period, overall from the 2001 and all the way through the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, all the way up to 2019. This doesn't capture the pandemic. I'm working on those figures now. But if we look at the big picture, who came out pretty well? China again. But Peru, I love Peru. It's my first love. I wrote my dissertation on the Peruvian political economy. And the interesting thing here is its high performance over time against the backdrop of pathetic politics. It's just pathetic. There's no political parties. The Congress is impeaching presidents, all kinds of ridiculous corruption. But I will insist that during the reform period, especially the 90s, Peru did get down to some serious reforms. They were painful. The losers were the majority. But those kinds of reforms and their micro level reforms were institutionalized, especially oversight of the mineral and commodities sector. So Peru is looking good. Costa Rica is looking good. Chile is doing well. And the big three, the emerging economies, are lagging. And Mexico is the laggard. It's just, this country had privileged access to the US market under NAFTA for 8 years, from 1994 to 2002. And there should be much higher growth here. It should be much more buoyant. So now let's look. The big thing is per capita, as growth economists tell us, theories of economic growth. So I've broken these figures out once again in a different way, and we can see the effects here of the slowdown. The first column on the left, growth of GDP, we can see that the aftermath of the boom, 2014, Chile, Costa Rica, and Peru are still really hanging in there. Mexico's doing okay for Mexico. By the way, it never gets better than 2.2% growth for Mexico through the 90s and all the 2000s. And of course, Argentina and Brazil, growth is in the basement. Now we get over to per capita income growth, which really I think is the key thing here in terms of moving the country, the nation, the people ahead in the international political economy. How is this going in terms of the entire nation? And Peru's per capita GDP growth up until the end of the boom, and then afterwards, hung on, all right? It hung on afterwards. Mexico, pathetic. I'm sorry, Mexico. It's just, what are you doing? Costa Rica, really pretty healthy. Chile has had a lot of issues around social policy and equity. It hung in there. And the really sad thing is Argentina and Brazil really they lost much of the really impressive per capita growth that they had seen during the boom. Very, very painful, actually. Now, let me go back. Let me get over to this gross fixed capital formation. This is public and private investment as a percent of GDP. And again, what are you doing, Brazil and Argentina? Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have the Chinese figure here, but it's at least, it's at least over 40% of GDP, right? We know they did a gigantic infrastructure drive as part of their, transformation. So the winners here are Peru and Chile. Mexico actually does okay here, but that's a lot of US foreign investment. But again, Argentina and Brazil, down. So let me just quickly, so by the time I was really writing, which would be 2015, 2016, it was clear that there was something big here. Most of the literature and the analyses were data descriptions, right? Important data descriptions on, trade, Chinese lending, Chinese outflows, investment outflows, which don't really take a big leap up until 2010. But it was a lot of description about data and whatnot. And so I thought to myself, okay, you are a political economist. You have been trained. I teach a course, always teach a course in development and international political economy. And I just went back to the literature and I thought, well, what does that literature, how could we take some of that literature and apply it to this new fascinating situation of China in Latin America that we've never seen before? So I'm just going to say these very briefly. I'm looking at my time. I want Francisco to have time for his comments, and then I want all of you because I want to leave at least 25 minutes for all of you. So I use Ha-Joon Chang's brilliant book, Kicking Away the Ladder, with regard to Mexico, and I talk about they jettisoned industrial policy in '92 to kiss up to the US, to get into NAFTA. They relegated industrial policy and technology transfer to foreign direct investment. Not a good idea. Argentina and Brazil, we're going to see, I took one out of many institutional indicators from the world governance indicators, World Bank, Brookings, all of that. And that's regulatory quality. And we're going to see, because, with these projects coming in and whatnot, this does capture some of the institutional vigor. And we can see that Argentina and Brazil just drove the institutions for that into the ground. And of course, Costa Rica, Chile, Peru did sign free trade agreements with China. China was the demandeur. They pursued that very vigorously with these three open economies. You talk to Chinese trade officials, where I can only really talk to them at conferences and international settings. It's impossible to get appointments in Beijing. But they said that they had done the ASEAN China Free Trade Agreement, and they wanted to practice negotiating free trade agreements with countries that had a lot of free trade agreements. Now, Mexico has far more, but that was not going to happen for them, given the trade deficit with Mexico. So China, Costa Rica went for the free trade agreement. I'm not saying that they did better and grew more and had higher per capita growth because of the free trade agreement. I'm saying that they were smart to institutionalize their relationship with China at the level of international law, trade and investment norms that are widely subscribed to, because Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, they're mucking around at the WTO, mucking around. Oops, sorry, kitty just fell, sorry. Mucking around with, anti-dumping and all kinds of lawsuits at the WTO against China, and it's gone nowhere. Okay, so I've already seen my data. Let me just go quickly. Competitive disadvantage, Mexico. It is tragic. We're all of you I know are pretty well versed in the region. I don't have to belabor the point that Mexico has seen terrible downward mobility over time. Mexico blames China. I blame Mexico for dropping the ball. This notion that they actually, bought into this notion that Ha-Joon Chang and kicked away the ladder absolutely disputes, right? Which is that, the success of the early, Britain, the US, whatnot was, based on, free trade and free investment policies. That's not true. So Mexico bit into that and they paid dearly for it, right? So, and of all things, Mexico has the least amount of foreign direct investment from China. It should have a huge amount. Of course, Brazil's the big winner here, and even Peru. So the FTA route, let me just say a couple of things here. And this is from the really wonderful literature from Richard Baldwin. A free trade agreement is not a development strategy proper. It is a venue. It is a way for a country to shape its relationship, not just with other countries or country X, but with the international system. So these three have done well, but they don't really have big industrial sectors, or really it's negligible. And so it works because of the complementarity. It's not perfect. We can discuss it in the Q&A, but it's worked pretty well. And then Brazil and Argentina. The complementary advantage here is just so luscious and rich. Soybeans, oil, minerals. In the case of Brazil, iron ore. They just weren't able to capture the moment. Regulatory quality, there is one big insight for me in this table. Well, there's two. One, Argentina really drove itself into the ground. That figure, the tan figure there, the bar, which is 214 to 219. Well, the orange figure isn't great, but all of those, it's the lowest in the region, and there's just no excuse for that. I mean, they just let it go, right? Brazil, also we see, a decline in regulatory quality, and this is really important. I mean, I could put 10 other indicators up here, but I insist that this really has to do with the oversight of China in these economies, because it is beginning to really take off after 2008. Not surprisingly, Chile, Costa Rica, Peru come up looking pretty well. But look at China. China's operating in the territory of Brazil and Argentina. And so all of these projects coming in and all of these, negative, I mean, there's a lot of problems in Ecuador with those dams. I mean, it's not great, right? However, and this is a big point, it's incumbent upon countries with higher levels of institutional integrity to hold China's feet to the fire. So China has run roughshod in Argentina, if you want my humble opinion, those hydroelectric plants in Patagonia and whatnot. Brazil's better, but even over here, when you get into Peru, there's been lots of social contestation over Chinese investment, in a lot of protests on the ground. And it is incumbent upon Peru. I mean, it's way more advanced in the institutional realm than China is. And you've got to really, take that to the bank, stand up for yourself. In summary, path dependence is so obvious to me in the three emerging economies. One thing I like about, especially, Costa Rica dropped Taiwan in 2007 and recognized China, but the small FTA countries, the open economies. I love Douglas North's book on institutions, and he talks about overcoming the automaticity of policy failure and, lowering the barriers of reform. He talks about it being possible, but it's a domestic project. It's a national project. Chile went through that process painfully, but fairly successfully in the 80s and 90s. But, this thing about, it's always going to be a failure. I think Argentina and Mexico they've been in that mindset, and you got to get out of it, to say the least. Okay, so I think I've said everything. I'm not following, okay, what is the policy, potential policy change with the US vis-a-vis Latin America and China in Latin America? Right now, they're rightfully focusing on this nasty Northern Triangle, nasty situation, just terrible, right? Drugs, people trafficking, arms trafficking, the whole thing. And I'm not expecting to see any big changes, but one big change would be to work with the multilaterals in really trying to strengthen domestic capacities around regulatory reform, anti-corruption, all kinds of things they're boring. Some people say, that's just the Washington consensus. It's not. It's a fundamental part of development, property rights, rule of law. But this is really, it's tedious, but I think this is the way things need to go. Let me stop and turn this over to Margaret or Francisco. Let me move on.
Thank you so much, Carol. That was fascinating. And we'll go straight to Francisco in the interest of time. The floor is yours.
Oh, did I stop sharing? No, I did not stop sharing. Oh, yes, I did. Okay.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be speaking to almost more than 200 people. Then we will have time to discuss on the Q&A different aspects of China's engagement in Latin America. Carl's book is a wonderful book. I got my copy here. Of course, I read it in detail. And what I can say before we move on the Q&A and the current agenda of China's engagement in the region, is that this is a book which comes at a great time. I would say, let me say something. I would say this book, Dragonomics, makes three large contributions for readers. And you don't need to be an expert on China, Latin American relations to enjoy and take a lot from this book. As she said, this is mostly a book on development strategies and how, as the subtitle says, how Latin American countries maximized or missed out China's engagement in the region. So as the first sentence of the book puts it, this is a book not about China, but it's more a reflection on Latin American development strategies. China is more or less an independent variable, I would say, in the book. And it summarizes very well Burgoyne literature, which is around 50 articles indexed in Web of Science a year, compared to 2, 3, 10 years ago. So the literature is also booming. And for you, if you or any of you are studying or doing research on this field, you will get from the book that this is an open agenda and there's a lot still to be discussed. What I liked from the book very much is that she provides very valuable policy lessons, because Carol Weiss divides countries into three groups: those which makes openness work, and those which falls in sort of an institutional resource course. That would be Argentina and Brazil, and those countries which suffer from deindustrialization, where she focuses in the case of Mexico. And given that it looks like, we don't know, we are in the midst of a pandemic, but it looks like we might be facing a new commodity super cycle in the following years. Her book is very, very relevant to understand how and why should Latin American countries be better prepared. The conclusions of the book, to me as a Latin American, as an Argentinian, are a little bittersweet, because I feel like there was sort of a missed chance on some countries regarding China's boom in the region. Yet the positive side is that her policy lessons are still valid. For instance, how to deal with counter-cyclical policies regarding commodity prices. And she engages with very recent literature on the IPE, Latin American politics. I'm thinking, for instance, on the recent book by Campelo and Suco, The Volatility Course, which discusses the impact of commodity shocks and domestic political representation, and a recent book by Sanchez Sanchorea on the cost of inequality in Latin America. So China at some point is responsible and voluntarily for both electoral advantages or disadvantages, depending on the competitive advantages of certain regions, and also it's an explanatory variable for an increasing inequality in the region, in the sense that those who managed to take the most of the commodity boom were the winners, so to say, and those who couldn't are sort of the losers. Kind of China at some point enhanced a dynamic of losers and winners from globalization in the region. And finally, I'm looking forward. So I think this book nowadays during the pandemic it's a very interesting read, because it makes you think of what's missing from China to be a real superpower in Latin American politics. So China gained a lot of traction in the last years, mostly through its economic statecraft, but still lacks soft power, or it still lacks legitimacy sometimes on the way it approaches some Latin American countries. And lots of surveys show that public opinion is still very defensive, or still have a lot of issues when they speak of China in general. There's a growing anti-China sentiment, I would say, even more so during the pandemic. There are tensions in the sense that China is a major economic superpower in the region, but still culturally and regarding legitimacy, still lacking what, for instance, the US has. If you want, we can discuss this further in detail in the Q&A, but I've carried out research recently on the mask diplomacy, as Carl was saying, and I surveyed people to know what they think of the vaccines, what they think of the mask donations. And what I see is that despite all the growth and all the leverage that China has in the region, there's still a lot of rejection. There's still a lot of resistance to accept that China is a major player in the hemisphere. As a summary, I would say that this book pretty much condenses what has been studied, what different scholars have been studying independently in the last 20 years in a wonderful way. It summarizes and analyzes very well China's impact in Latin America between its accession to the World Trade Organization and 2018, 2019. And there are lots of lessons to be taken from the book. And lots of them are very important to be taken into account looking forward. So if you are a policymaker, please do take a look at the book, because you will get a lot of policy lessons from it.
Thank you so much, Francisco. That was terrific, and thank you also for highlighting some of your more recent analysis, which is, a tremendous contribution always to the literature on the topic. We have a ton of wonderful questions in the Q&A, so I want to get straight to those. And what I'd like to do is just pose a couple of them, and both of you, whoever would like to answer, please feel free and to do so. Let me start with a question on Mexico, because that's featured very prominently already throughout the Q&A. Carol, you've painted a fairly bleak picture of Mexico and Mexico's growth and growth prospects. But Lourdes Casanova, a fellow China Latin America watcher, has made some mention in the Q&A of some recent developments in the China-Mexico relationship, including some investments from Chinese tech firms such as Didi, Tencent, and others, and also Mexico now having recovered its position as the main trade partner for the US. But then in addition to this, and I mean, having just discovered this over the past few days, Mexico's appointed now Jesus Seade, right, who former head of the WTO, to be the ambassador to China, which to me suggests something interesting, right? Perhaps some interest in a free trade agreement, even though that would be very difficult from a structural perspective, right, to negotiate, or simply an interest in attracting more in the way of investment to Mexico, Chinese investment to Mexico, with the North American market in mind. So is there a prospect, do you think, for an improvement or for some new policy that could in fact, harness some of the benefits of Chinese engagement more extensively? And then beyond, let me give you one more question just so you can pick and choose as needed. There's a great question in here from, let me see if I can make sure that I attribute this properly, from Emilia Rincon. How can other countries in South America maximize their relationship with China? Oh, that's the wrong Emilia question, actually. But she was noting that China has, of course, made much mention of its own efforts to achieve poverty reduction at home, and sees that as a tremendous success, right, in its own history. to what extent, we see growth, GDP growth from a number of these countries, but are these benefits being transferred to the population? To what extent do we see, major social improvements or other social policy that is in some ways the result of higher rates of growth among these so-called winners, right, in the China Latin America dynamic? So let me turn that to both of you, whoever would like to comment first.
Hi, Lourdes. You always keep me honest. Thank you for your question. I was just starting to answer questions. I was typing them in the Q&A to some of you. So, Lourdes, yes, I mean, there are some important Chinese investments in Mexico. Let me just say, though, that the business environment in Mexico is not hospitable to investment. And one thing about China, I mean, they bid very seriously on those oil tenders out in the big finds in the Mexican side of the Gulf of Mexico. I think the Chinese have at least $2 billion sunk into those, those lots they bid on. AMLO, López Obrador, has really kept them in limbo for the last 2 years or 3 years now. He was elected, I believe, in 2018. It's like, what's going to happen? Or is he going to renege on this? And I believe he's been responsible for creating a lot of business uncertainty. And I don't see the appointment of the ambassador is good. I was at the Mexican embassy in Beijing in 2019. And it was like a ghost town. They had closed the Pro Mexico office. There were like two guys holding down the fort from, the Ministry of Economia, which is where trade and investment are done. So I think that Mexico has a tremendous potential to partner with China and to host China in so many ways. If we look at some of the infrastructure investments, what are they calling that? The place in Cancun, the one-stop shopping for Chinese goods, that's shut down, halfway built. So many hydroelectric highways, all of that has gotten, investments, Chinese attempts to get into the auto sector. A lot of that is, just either stopped by social protests or by government, incompetence on the Mexican side. So if there's a will, China's done well, given how kind of uneven and iffy the Mexican side is. If the government decided to go for it big time and really make Chinese investment a priority, it could be incredible. But I don't think they're even half there. What's the other question, Margaret? Is that about poverty reduction? You're muted.
Yeah, poverty reduction, but more generally in relation, we see growth, obviously, among some of these winners, GDP growth. But has that, in any way translated to the broader population, or is it, are we seeing, the effects more limited to those to the elite?
Let me turn. I'm going to say one thing. Sorry, Margaret. One thing, and then I'm going to turn it to Francisco, and that is the following. Somebody else said, or I forget who it was, but I just answered something online here about poverty reduction. And let me just be clear. China has been, up until 2014, 2015, a major trigger for growth across the region, even in countries like Central America that are getting clobbered by, Chinese invasion of goods into their markets, have benefited from these super high commodity prices, right? So the space to implement important poverty reduction forms and, equity reforms was there until, I would say, 2014. And it's not what China has done. It's what countries have done with the leeway that China opened up for them to do it. And I go to Peru, I still see people living in horrible mud huts on the side of, mountains and hills with mudslides. It's pretty bad. But in a report published about a year and a half ago, I'm blanking on it, but Peru was the one country that really made a leap in terms of per capita income gains. And see, per capita is, I think, where the action is, right? Because this is absolute growth, not, relative. It's absolute. Are people moving above the poverty line or aren't they? And so that's up to these countries. I mean, now it's dire, and I'm going to turn that part of it to Francisco. It's dire, but when there was a major opportunity, we did see some gains. But we also saw some backsliding in Brazil and Argentina. Francisco, I'm going to let you take the rest of this.
Well, I agree with you, Carl, and I think that down the line, what we see, at least I've done extensive research in the case of Brazil. Um, what you see is that despite the fact that the commodity boom was beneficial for the country as a whole, uh, the again it reinforced this dynamic of winners and losers in the sense that some areas, certain industries were better prepared to capitalize and take the best of China's demand, while other simply could not adapt to it, and that intensified the already existing differences, for instance, in a large country as Brazil is. And what's interesting to note from this research we have carried out is that people are aware of this. So if you ask people what do they think about their country's engagement with Brazil, with China, sorry, it very much depends on whether they are winners or losers, so to say, so to speak. And that translates also to policymakers. Legislators and governors would tend to be very prone to uh, attract Chinese investments or export to China uh, if they consider that that brings a benefit to their local economies. Otherwise, they will become very much reticent and protectionist and adopt a very a very defensive standpoint. Um,
That's with the winners and losers. Then regarding poverty reduction, I also agree that, well, China has definitely been, it's historical, right, that what China has done domestically with regards to reducing poverty at home. um Yet I'm not sure that there's sort of a Chinese model that we could replicate in the region. I am not very sure about it. Some people might be. I would say that there are certain policies in China, like the hukou system, which were very functional to the government to um, drive this policy in the field. In Latin America, it's much harder, and what we call in the informal market is very large, and it's a tough policy to apply. Well, it's the most unequal region in the world. Um, Yet, what I take from Carl's book, to come back to the book, is that if you don't even need a developmental policy towards China. You need much less. I mean, as she said, free trade agreements are not even considered a development policy, but you need to institutionalize a relationship and try to formalize a relationship so that when the commodity boom expires, something will remain. What occurred in commodity export countries which did not institutionalize that relationship is that eventually China's boom vanished, and first came the trade war, then came the pandemic, and they are stuck in a situation in which that demand is not there. So in the case of Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, even Uruguay, the Mercosur countries, they could have done a better job at um, institutionalizing, for instance, through a free trade agreement with China, um, or bilateral investment treaties. Let's move ahead to another question because there are so many.
Margaret, can I answer? So many of my colleagues are writing to me online here. I've got David Maris, I've got Jean Dodlin from Carleton University in Ottawa.
Yeah,
So
certainly. What I do want to do is leave a little bit of time to look ahead, because we have a lot of questions about what may happen now, given some interesting electoral outcomes in the region. So please feel free to respond if there's one that strikes you, and then let's leave 5 minutes at least to talk about what's going to happen next.
So these are just the best questions. I've got like 28 Q&A. I'm answering some of them. I can't answer them all. We have 10 minutes, but please reach out to me, stay wise at usc.edu, because it's such a great discussion. I'm really appreciative. I'm touched. Okay, so there's two questions that are linked. One is asking the relationship between this massive boom. I mean, Brazil was sitting on billions of dollars of reserves at one point. So was Argentina, right? And so this massive boom, literally in capital flow inflows from exports, investment, whatnot, and corruption. And let me just say that corruption's tricky, isn't it? Because I think in China, corruption coincides comfortably with economic development and growth and perceived success. I'm not condoning corruption, but it's a fact of life. Look at Wall Street in 2008, 2009. That was the mother of all corruption schemes, right? The so-called global financial crisis is the New York financial crisis. So, so did this wealth open up possibilities for corruption? It always does. But the one that I think was really tragic and most related to the boom is, of course, the Petrobras scandal. Someone was asking me about the same person, Lula, and the Brazilian president at the time. And let me just say, Lula tried. He tried to harness that money into an industrial policy. And Kathy Hofstadter and Al Montero have a wonderful paper in the Journal of Development Studies that looks exactly what the Brazilian Development Bank did with these funds for industrial policy. And there was this gravitational pull, even though they tried to put it into industries and high tech and innovation, the bulk of the industrial policy funds went toward Petrobras, okay, and toward oil exploration and development. And of course, it was just too juicy. By the way, Lula is out of jail. He might not be guilty. It's hard for me to accept that he's guilty. Go ahead, Margaret.
Thanks so much, Carol. I appreciate that. And of course, that was actually one of the questions I had hoped to get to. So thank you so much for addressing it. No, we have a number of questions in here asking us to sort of look ahead, not only in terms of sort of electoral outcomes in the region and what those might mean for relations with China, but also for some of the policy developments that could shape the bilateral relationship with China. I think probably people are thinking most specifically about Ecuador and Peru here. So if you have any thoughts on either of those, that would be quite interesting. It would, if either of you would like to address Colombia, there is a request for some information or analysis on that country in particular. That's probably all we have time for. So let's go ahead and turn to that.
When this book manuscript went under review, right? Oh boy, it's like, why doesn't she have chapters on Venezuela and Ecuador? Because I was looking for really interesting cases of development, economics, models that we could update for the 21st century. And Venezuela, Ecuador is like taking us back to the 1950s. It's just a good old fashioned rip-roaring resource curse. It's very sad, but to be kind of nerdy, it's not theory building. It doesn't build, I don't feel like going back over the bad news. Colombia, I do think merits much more attention. For some reason, there's just not a vibrant culture of China studies academically or in the policy arena. It's in the local newspapers, but you're not seeing a lot. And it's not coming up on the radar screen. I took countries in South America that had the really strong trade and investment ties. and loans with China, and it just doesn't come up. It just, it's kind of, but it definitely it warrants much more attention. Margaret, I'm brain dead on Peru and Ecuador. What was the what was the question?
Oh, simply the outcomes from the recent election. I mean, we have sort of two extreme possibilities in the case of Peru, right? And in terms of the presidential elections outcomes. And then a new president in Ecuador who may not be so inclined to engage extensively with China, and yet probably will need to engage with China to some degree. And so one wonders, whether there will be, first of all, more in the way of outreach or collaboration, and then on the other hand, any important changes to policy, investment-related policy or otherwise, that might shape outcomes in China, Ecuador, Peru, or other relations, right, in the region as we look at electoral outcomes across the board.
I had an economics professor in grad school, Carlos Diaz Alejandro. He's an economist, right? But he taught a political economy graduate course, and he said, "You may not believe this. I'm an economist, but I'm going to tell you, never make political predictions." And I've taken that to heart. Peru is just, it astounds me. I just don't see how they could go on for so long with such wretched politics. And Peruvians, I love you. How could they go on with this wretched? And Francisco Sagasti is like the only modern statesperson to pop up in all of this. And I'm really sorry he couldn't continue as president. I'm really sorry. But that's the way the politics and the lack of a stable party system has worked out. I don't know about this new person. It's scary. I'm going to let Francisco say something about Ecuador because I feel distant. I am distant from the region. I'm in these places, and it's just, I'm not really sure what to make of Ecuador.
By all means.
There's something.
Or on any of the questions, frankly, anything else you'd like to address?
We have just a few minutes. So very quickly, I would say that Ecuador is very interesting to look at how the US might want to reapproach the region. Ecuador was a country which had very deep relations with China in the last 20 years, especially in the field of investments and loans. And it wasn't an easy path. You might remember the politicization of the Coca-Cola project. And recently, in the last weeks, I would say, of the Trump administration, there was this offer to repay a loan or certain loans that Ecuador has with Chinese policy banks. And I saw that as one of the first attempts by the US to actively engage in South America, trying to counteract Chinese economic statecraft. At least in the last 5 years, I wouldn't think of another one. Although I could think of the role that the US is having more so in the one China policy, and there's a question about it in the Q&A by Patricia. I would say that the US is trying to support Taiwan's diplomatic allies in the Caribbean, and trying to explicitly or implicitly threat those countries that if they switch their diplomatic recognition towards China, they might face certain economic consequences. So I would say that the US is trying to support Taiwan's mission in the region. I mean, most allies that Taiwan has are in our hemisphere. So the survival of Taiwan's international recognition depends on how well it does in our hemisphere. So the US, I think, understands that and is trying to counteract a bit the heavy weight of Chinese loans and investments that sometimes tempt countries like Costa Rica or Panama to switch relationships. So as a summary of everything I said, I would say that the US is certainly trying to address China more with more decision, trying to counteract a bit the very large leverage that Chinese economic statecraft has in the region. So we might see more of what happened in Ecuador, we might see more support towards Taiwan allies. We might see a stringent discussion on the 5G infrastructure. That's what I foresee, which means at some point a continuation of Trump's policy towards the region, with regards to China at least. I don't see many changes.
Thank you so much. Well, we have finished the hour with having addressed not all of the questions by any means, but these are terrific questions across the board. I will for sure copy them and send them to Carol and Francisco so that perhaps some of these conversations can be carried on offline. We thank you all so much for your participation, and especially to our speakers, Carol Wise and Francisco Ordines, for their excellent contributions. This gives us a sense of what's happened, in terms of the relationship, who's emerged in a better position and who hasn't as a result of Chinese engagement, or perhaps despite it, in recent years, right? And we'll also see, the onus is very clearly on Latin American governments to make this relationship work out, but also on China in terms of its own engagement and the quality of that engagement. And we'll see if the 14th five-year plan and this commitment that's articulated there to high quality and sustainability indeed translates into Chinese engagement with the region in the coming years. So much still to be seen. Thank you again. We are so grateful for your participation, and look forward to seeing it at a future event.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you so very much. Bye. Thank you.